عمالنا بيجي كل مرة بيجي for one day only. Definitely next time I plan to stay more وحتى هيك get to تعرف شوي على البراكتس وكل شيء. كثير من اصحابي كلهم موجودين هون، دائما بنشوف بعض بالكونفرنسز، ما كثير بنفضل بعض نشوف بعضنا لا بعمان ولا ببيروت. So جد give me great pleasure. I know انه المستوى is so high. I can see the work, I can see the talks, I can see تبع كل الكوليجز هون, and I think مثل ما عم تقول it will be great to have this kind of cooperation between both countries. We're so close to each other, we can share expertise. We have definitely gurus in their own in their own fields بكل بلد, so it will be great to do that. Without further ado, I know already تأخرت عليكم, sorry. So I want to share my experience with the MS-39. In general, I'm going to talk about HD OCT in general, the newer generation HD OCT, and MS-39 specifically, because I was the first user in the Middle East more than 4 years ago. When I got the device, I saw it. I saw a lot of potentials in it. كان بعده جديد, and I developed this experience with time. Now it's interesting because I can treat with it as well, because it was linked to the Schwenk excimer laser. But anyway, it helps you from diagnosis to treatments. And a quick thing, I think there are two devices that are amazing right now on the market, Huawei والانتيريون. بس بفسركم شوي شو difference and why the MS-39, even though بتشوفوا very nice images of the anterior, the reason why they work on different wavelengths. So the anterior is more about deeper structures. So يمكن تشوفوا أكتر اللens, a little bit the sulcus better, but you will not see as good in the cornea with the anterior. So in terms of cornea, this is still the highest resolution device, down to 3 microns. So بس تعرفوا إنه you might see very nice things, and I think the anterior is amazing OCT, but the anterior is more focused behind the iris. The resolution goes down a little bit بحكم الwavelength تبعه على الcornea, while this is the device, the highest resolution device on the cornea. It's nice to understand that. So again, this is an in-depth corneal analysis with the MS-39. Again, from diagnosis to treatments. Just want to make sure إنه ما أخر عليكم, so بس نحط التايم. Thank you. All right. So there are many reasons why I think, in general, OCT is better than Scheinflug. Now, of course, the Anko Scheinflug is still great, and a lot of you have Pentacam that you can combine with Corvus, and I think this is very important. But for sure, I think, and you will see that there is a major trend to replace the Scheinflug technology with OCT at one point in time. In my case, I run always a Scheinflug, always, but I have an OCT that I run it on every single visit. I have a refractive practice, so every single patient بيجي, anytime بيجي, it's like having a quick snapshot. كيف واحد بيجي بيصور صورة, the patient has to have an MS-39 imaging, and I'll tell you why later. Even for a routine visit, I'll tell you why later. So better corneal pachymetry, there are 5 reasons: better posterior curvature mapping, better posterior corneal higher order aberration, the option of segmental tomography, and the option of OCT sections. So let's start a little bit with better pachymetry and posterior curvature. So لما بتشوفوا هون, this is a patient who has had cross-linking before, and as you can see, there is haze deep in the cross-linking cornea. On Scheinflug, on the left-hand side, you see that the corneal pachymetry is 308 microns. However, on the OCT, which is here, the MS-39, is 368. Now, you probably all know about this artifact, so we have published this in a prospective study. We compared high-frequency ultrasound to OCT to Scheinflug back in 2016 in AJO, and then we have shown that the higher the haze, the thinner the cornea looks on Scheinflug, but not on OCT, and definitely not on high-frequency ultrasound. The OCT has, and Cynthia Roberts confirmed that due to our publication, has a little bit of overcorrection. يعني يمكن تشوفوا أسمك شوي على OCT, بس الشكل بتشوفوا much thinner, and high frequency ultrasound is dead on. So if you have to follow a patient post cross-linking, the best way to follow him or her is using OCT, not using a Scheinflug, because Scheinflug is heavily dependent on the haze and can give you a much thinner cornea than what you really think it is. Another example on the sensitivity of Scheinflug to artifact is the following. You had a patient with a very small disc scar, a welding scar. So as you can see, there is a posterior elevation right underneath that disc scar. If it was inferior, you would have thought that the patient has keratoconus. And if you saw those maps without the slit lamp, if somebody came and told you, okay, here are the pentacam, for instance, what do you think? And you say keratoconus, of course not yet, but if it was a little bit inferior. The issue is, that's why I don't like to see pentacams or topographies without seeing the patients or without seeing the raw image, always as usual. And of course, if you run an MS-39, there's nothing, it's pristine. So it's much less dependent on artifacts, and that's why not all of our patients are perfect pristine. A lot of them have been operated before, whether cross-linking or any types of surgeries, and they have scatter in their cornea, and that's why shunting is heavily dependent on scatter. And that makes it even more important to evaluate the ABCD of Bellin and Bellin using OCT, especially after cross-linking. And the ABCD score is now present on the MS-39, not as developed as you see on the pentacam, but you don't need that. All what you need is, again, اللي ما بيعرف ABCD, A is the central 3 millimeter corneal curvature centered on the thinnest point. B is on the back surface, so central 3 millimeter average on the back surface. C stands for corneal pachymetry. So, and D for vision. So using this scale is much better than using single point K-max to see if the patient is evolving or not. And because the back surface is heavily dependent on good measurements, again, doing it on OCT is much better than doing it on shunting. And again, if you want to look at corneal power, for instance, somebody who is post-arcade, again, looking at the posterior curvature using shunting is not as dependent as when you look at it using MS-39. And again, by the way, you have a ray tracing in the MS-39 that can automatically calculate everything for you. It's been published by Giacomo Sabini in JCRS, and it works perfectly well for myopes and hyphomopes as well. And finally, total corneal wavefront error is heavily dependent on posterior curvature. So if you want to look at a keratoconus patients and evaluate the true corneal coma, it's the anterior coma minus the posterior coma. So to be able to look at the posterior coma, you need an OCT device. Now, enough looking at the deeper structure. Let's go back a little bit on the surface and look at the epithelium and why using segmental tomography OCT is better. This is a patient with such an anterior tangential curvature. Okay, so it's tangential, not axial. Let's take a look at corneal pachymetry. It's thin, and you see an inferior steepening, double inferior steepening. Okay, this is an absolute score. Let's look at posterior elevation. It looks okay. Well, does this patient has keratoconus? Maybe, but how come the posterior elevation is so pristine? Let's take a look at the posterior curvature. And the posterior curvature, instantaneous curvature, looks very nice. It's a bow tie. How can a keratoconus patient present with a normal posterior curvature? Posterior elevation, honestly, I don't like it much because it's heavily dependent on the reference sphere, and this depends on angle alpha and kappa, but posterior curvature is much better. There is a trend now to go back and look at posterior curvature. If you don't look at it, please do. And if you look here, very nice bow tie posterior curvature and an inferior steepening on the anterior curvature. By looking at this, I suspect this patient does not have keratoconus, even though the patient has thin cornea. It's just a coincidental finding. Now, if you look at, this is the anterior curvature, and that's the posterior tangential curvature, and you see there's a big mismatch. Now let's look at the epithelial mapping, and as you can see here, you see a much thicker central to inferior than superior. Now mind you, the epithelium is always thinner superiorly than inferiorly, probably due to the eyelid squashing effect, okay? But not as much. You see that central to inferior is 53, while superior is 46, and this creates this kind of mismatch, and this creates this inferior steepen. So this, again, look at even the direction and the angle. This is another patient where you can see this hexa map, you can see this is the anterior curvature, and you can see that's the thickness. Again, this is the thin cornea, just happened to be like that. But look at the epithelium. It's very thin. A normal epithelium should be 55. Now, if a patient not just has warpage, if the patient suffers from dry eyes, the epithelium will be thinner for two reasons. The tear film is thin, it's almost zero, so that's 5 microns, 3 to 5 microns less, but also the epithelium is dehydrated, especially the cuboids, like cuboidal cells. So you can have a thickness from 50 to 55 going down to 40 just because it's dehydrated. So when you see a very thin epithelium, suspect also that the patient has a lot of ocular surface diseases and dryness. So 2 weeks with heavy lubrication and off contact lens, and you can see now how the cornea is perfect now. It's completely normal. But more importantly, you can see that the epithelium is good as well. And this sometimes guides me to see if the patient needs a little bit more of a break from his or her contact lens and more lubrication. I look at the epithelium, how the epithelium is changing, and look at curvature. And if the epithelium is still irregular, I know that the curvature can still get better. Now this patient, we ended up doing an ICL for her because ultimately, for her thin cornea. Now this is a +3 diopter hyperopic ablation. How would you know that it's a hyperopic ablation? Of course, the curvature gets steeper the more you go to the center. So that's a prolate, a super prolate cornea. But also, if you look at the epithelium is thinner in the center than it is at the periphery. Now that's a +3 diopters, -3 diopters, same amount of correction, myopic patient. Now again, as you see here, the cornea gets flatter the more you go to the center. That's an oblate cornea. But more importantly, the epithelium is thicker in the center, and this is again following the 5 rule of the epithelial remodeling according to Dan Reinstein. So the epithelium is thinner when the curvature is high, the epithelium is thicker when the cornea is flatter, and so on. So now let's put them side by side. What do you notice here? With a -3 diopter, the central epithelium thickness is 60, the periphery is 53. So the difference is about 7 micron. Okay? With the same amount of treatment on hyperopic ablation, +3, the central 42, the epithelium at the periphery is 62. That's 20 micron difference. That's almost 3 times more remodeling than this. And this tells you that the remodeling in hyperopes is much higher than the myopes. Here it's 3 times. What's worse, and that's what's been shown with Dan Reinstein, that it's very fluctuating between one another. So take another 3 diopter hyperope, you might see a difference of 7. Another one, a difference of 20. Another one, a difference of 15. So it's much more haphazard, and this depends on the optical zone. Which means if you go with a larger optical zone, you have less epithelial remodeling. And that's why in hyperopes, epithelium will guide your treatment. And I look at my patient, see the epithelial remodeling, and I say, okay, you know what? I'm gonna go with a larger optical zone. If a patient comes to you with regression, you look at the patient, you see, is this epithelial regression? Is it stroma, or is it just loss of accommodation? Because a lot of our hyperopic patient regress not because the treatment, the hyperopic treatment is not good, because they lose their accommodation. Case in point, I had a patient about a week ago who came to me. She had a +2.5 diopter 15 years ago when I started my practice. I saw her for refractive. She decided not to do the procedure and was lost to follow. She came a week ago with +4.5 sacroplegic refraction. So 2 diopters of relaxation within 15 years. If I did refractive surgery at the time, I would have thought that, you know what, hyperopic treatment don't work. That's why. But they do. And if I look at the SIMK in many patients is exactly the same as it was 2 to 3 years ago. Yet there is regression. Now you have another tool to look at, that's the epithelium, your epithelium. And that's why the larger you go with the hyperopes, the less the epithelial remodeling and the less haphazard it is. As opposed to myopes. Myopes, if you go from 6.3 to 7, it's nice, it has less spherical aberration, but not much on epithelial remodeling. Of course, if you go below 6, then you have a huge epithelial remodeling. But with hyperope, the larger the better. That's why you need larger flaps, and then again, larger optical zones. And again, if you're not looking at the epithelium, you're not doing refractive surgery. That's not me, that's Dan Reinstein who said it. He told me one time, did I say that? I was so mean. But that's true. With time, at least, we don't drive a car without a seatbelt or an airbag, but 20 years ago we used to. So this is the same thing. Maybe a few years ago or 10 years ago it was allowed to do refractive surgery without epithelium. But right now, I think, in my opinion, if you're serious about refractive surgery, you have to always look at the epithelium as another. We can't anymore, just like we used to look at placido, now we started looking at the posterior float. Now we have to look at segmental tomography, looking at the epithelium, at the stroma, and at the OCT section. Now again, coming to OCT sections, I think OCT sections gives in general, the MS-39 or any high definition OCT, such a big advantage over irregular slit lamp. And I'm going to show you why. Now this is a patient I'm not going to tell you what it is, but look at what the patient has. What do you think that is? No. It's a flap, of course. Interestingly, and this is a tip, the flap always looks hyporeflective in the middle, but hyper-reflective in the periphery. Nobody knows exactly why on OCT, but one of the reasons, again, that the keratocytic activity is more at the periphery than in the center. With time, you could see that. So trust me, when you see that, that's a flap. But here, that's a flap. but it's hyperreflective of the periphery and hyperreflective of the center. Now we're going to show you and guide you, not just to say it's a flap, to know exactly what kind of flap is this. We published a chapter, it's actually now about to be published in the US in spring